I should say first that I told you I was going to do this. At the end of the last episode, I said I walked through Times Square at midnight. I said the people who were there because they wanted to be, or because they had nowhere else to be, and that the difference was visible if you looked. I said, come back, I'll tell you what I saw. I am going to tell you what I saw. But I want to start with something more basic, which is, why midnight? I have been living in New York for 33 years. I have been in Times Square at midnight, not this specific midnight, but various midnights across various years, more times than I could count. After late theater performances, after dinners that went long, after the specific occasions that New York produces at night, that extend past the hour when sensible people go home. Midnight in Times Square is not, for me, a new experience. What I did on a Tuesday in March that I have not done before is this. I went specifically. I went with no preceding occasion that deposited me there. I went with the intention of being there, of looking, of walking through the specific geography of Times Square at midnight, with the attention I have been bringing to things all year. The looking rather than the seeing, the attending rather than the processing. I went with a notebook. I came back with 6 pages of notes, written in the specific shorthand of someone writing fast in the dark, in order to catch the impression before the impression becomes a summary. I want to tell you what I found. I have been thinking about Times Square since episode 11, when I stood on the corner of 44th and Broadway on a Tuesday evening and looked at the signs. I looked at what the signs were doing, what they were selling, what the accumulated attention of the people who passed them represented as a resource. I looked at the signs in the early evening, at 6:30, in the specific light of a January dusk, when the neon was beginning to compete with the last of the natural light from the west. I wanted to see it without the competition. Midnight is when the natural light is entirely gone and the artificial light is entirely itself, not competing, not supplementing, not filling in the gaps left by the sun. At midnight, what you see is what the city has chosen to make visible. What is lit by intention, and what is dark by intention or by neglect, and the difference between the two tells you something about what the city values and what it does not value, and how those two things distribute across the geography of the block. I went at midnight because I wanted to see what Times Square chooses to be when it doesn't have to be anything else. This is different from seeing it at noon, when the sun flattens everything and the signs compete with a light source they cannot entirely overcome. Different from seeing it at 6 in the evening, when the sky and the signs are in a conversation about which is more powerful, and the sky is losing, but not yet lost. Midnight is when the conversation is over, and the signs have won completely, and you can see exactly what the winning looks like. I left my apartment at 11:30. The streets between 54th and 47th were the streets I know, my neighborhood, the specific block composition of Midtown Manhattan in the specific cold of a March night, which is not the deep cold of January, but the wet cold of late winter, the cold that comes with dampness, that gets into the coat rather than being repelled by it. My breath in the air. The specific quality of wet March pavement, the reflective surface that takes all the available light and fractures it and returns it at angles you don't expect. I arrived at Times Square at approximately midnight. The light. I described the light from outside, looking at it from the corner of 44th and Broadway in January, and I described it as an enormous amount of light from an enormous number of sources. This is still true at midnight, and it is truer at midnight. The sources are more themselves without the competition of the sky. The colors are more saturated. The contrast between the lit and the unlit is sharper and more dramatic. Let me try to be specific about the colors, because the colors at midnight in Times Square are not the colors of daylight, and they are not the colors of ordinary artificial light. They are the colors of neon, which is a distinct and specific palette. Neon produces light through the passage of electrical current through gas sealed in glass tubes. Different gases produce different colors. Neon gas itself produces the red-orange that we call neon red, though the word neon has come to be applied to any bright sign light, regardless of the gas used. Mercury produces blue-violet. Helium produces pinkish-white. Argon produces lavender. Krypton produces silvery white or green. The result, in aggregate, in Times Square at midnight, is a light that has no analog in the natural world. It is not sunset. Sunset produces warm oranges and reds, but they are diffused across the sky. They come from above. They bathe rather than target. It is not fire. Fire has movement and warmth, and the specific organic unpredictability of something burning. It is not sunlight. Sunlight is cool and even and flat in its distribution. Neon is what it is. A precise, sustained, steady illumination in colors that the natural world produces only fleetingly and only at specific hours, but that neon produces continuously, reliably, at whatever hour someone chooses to power the sign. I stood at the corner of 44th and Broadway and looked at this light. The light was on my face, on my hands, coloring the wet pavement beneath my feet in competing patches, the red from the Coca-Cola sign, the blue-white from something across the street, the amber of the ordinary street lamps at the intervals where neon did not reach. I was standing in a painting. Not a painting of a place, a painting that was itself a place, that existed in 3 dimensions, and that I was inside rather than observing from outside. The colors were around me rather than in front of me. I wrote in the notebook, "The color is everywhere at once." Now I want to tell you about the people, because Times Square at midnight is about the people as much as it is about the light. And the people at midnight are not the same as the people at noon, and not the same as the people at 6 in the evening. And the differences are not random. The theater crowd is gone. The theater performances end at 10 or 10:30, and the audience disperses. Some to restaurants nearby, some directly home, some to bars for post-theater drinks. By midnight, the theater crowd has been absorbed into the ordinary flows of the city, and what remains is something else. What remains? The workers. The people who are there because Times Square runs on people working at hours when other people are not working. The stagehands breaking down sets, the restaurant staff cleaning after the last service, the hotel employees maintaining the lobbies, the drivers and the porters and the cleaning crews who do the overnight work of maintaining the machinery of a neighborhood that operates 24 hours. These people are in Times Square at midnight because their jobs are in Times Square at midnight. They move through the space with the efficient, purposeful movement of people who are going somewhere specific and who do not have time to appreciate the scenery because they are part of the scenery's maintenance. I noticed them, and I wrote them down. The performers. Times Square at midnight still has its theaters, the later shows, the midnight performances, the specific entertainment that exists only at these hours for the specific audience that wants it at these hours. The performers moving between venues, the musicians who have just finished a set and are heading to another, the specific energy of people who have been on for 3 or 4 hours and are now in the transit between the ending and whatever comes next. I noticed one musician, saxophone case under his arm, walking fast, looking at no one, who had the specific post-performance quality that I recognize from my own experience. The body still warm from the work, the mind partly still in it, the person in the process of returning to themselves from whoever they were on the stage or at the microphone. I noticed him and wrote him down. The people with nowhere else to be. I told you I was going to tell you about the difference between people who are there because they want to be and people who are there because they have nowhere else to be. This is the harder category to look at, and I want to look at it honestly. Times Square at midnight in March 1948 is not entirely safe. Not in the way of a place with active violence. I was not in danger. I am not describing a combat zone. But it has areas and hours where the people present are people who are present because the alternatives available to them are more difficult or less hospitable than the public space of Times Square. The man sitting on the steps of the building at the corner of 43rd, the woman in the doorway of the closed restaurant who was not waiting for anyone who would come, the group of young men at the corner who were not going anywhere, who were at the corner the way the corner was their living room, because the corner was the space available to them. I am not performing sympathy here. I am describing what I saw, and what I saw was people whose relationship to midnight in Times Square is different from my relationship to midnight in Times Square, because my relationship involves the choice to be there, and theirs involves the choice among limited alternatives. The difference matters. I wrote it down. I have 6 pages of notes from Tuesday night. I am not going to read you all 6 pages. I am going to tell you the things I wrote down because they mattered and that I have been returning to in the days since. The automat at 1 a.m. At approximately 1 in the morning, I went into the Horn and Hardart automat on 42nd Street for coffee. I have been walking for an hour, and the March cold has made coffee both desirable and legitimate. The automat at 1 in the morning is a different institution from the automat at noon. At noon, I described it in episode 5 as the democratic restaurant, the place where a woman alone at a table is just a customer, where the machine's only requirement is the correct number of nickels, where the absence of a human intermediary means the absence of judgment. At 1 in the morning, the automat is still democratic, but the democracy it hosts is a different democracy. The people at the tables at 1 in the morning are not the lunchtime working people who come and go efficiently. They are people who have found in the automat's all-night availability a specific resource, a warm, lit space with coffee and food at reasonable prices that asks nothing of you except your presence and your nickels. There was a man reading a newspaper from several hours ago. Not the news, just something to look at while he sat. There was a couple who were not speaking. Not in conflict, not estranged, but in the specific companionable silence of people who have been together long enough that silence is its own form of company. There was a woman writing something. I could not see what. She had a notebook like mine and was writing with the focused attention of someone for whom the writing was the primary activity, and the automat was the container for it. I sat with my coffee. I thought, this is also New York. Not the New York of the billboards and the theater marquees and the neon, though that New York was visible through the window, still lit, still itself. This New York. The automat at 1 in the morning, warm, democratic, hosting the people who needed a warm and democratic space at 1 in the morning, and asking nothing in return except the nickels. I wrote, the automat is honest at all hours. At some point, I am not certain of the exact time because I was not tracking time carefully, which was deliberate, because tracking time is a form of management, and I had come to not manage. At some point on my walk, I passed a club. Not a jazz club specifically. I do not know what kind of club it was. The sign said something I did not record in the notebook. The music was audible from the street, but muffled by the door and the walls, reduced to its base elements by the physics of sound traveling through building materials. What came through the door was the beat. Everything else was absorbed by the walls, the melody, the specific instruments, the harmonic relationships, the improvisational choices. All of that stayed inside. What made it to the street was the beat. The low, rhythmic pulse of the percussion and the bass that is the foundation beneath everything else the music does. I stopped on the sidewalk and listened. The beat alone, without the melody. There is something in this that I wrote about and have been thinking about since. The beat is what the body hears first. It is what synchronized us before language existed. It is what made the first music, music, rather than sound. The melody is what we added, the specific, culturally shaped, intellectually organized layer of pitch and harmony and form that distinguishes a song from a rhythm. But underneath the melody, underneath all of it, the beat continues. The beat is what came through the wall at 1 a.m. I stood on the sidewalk in March and listened to the beat coming through the wall of a club I could not see into, and I thought about all the music I had encountered this year. Parker's jazz in the room, Sinatra's voice on the record, and I thought, underneath all of it, this, the beat, the pulse, the rhythm that is also the heartbeat and also the footstep and also the metronome of the work. I want to describe something visual. At approximately 12:30, on the corner of 46th and 7th Avenue, it had been raining lightly for several minutes. Not enough rain to make you go inside, the specific light rain of March that gets into your coat rather than requiring an umbrella, that mists your face and makes the air smell of the specific combination of wet stone and engine exhaust and whatever else a city produces when its surfaces are damp. The pavement was wet, and the neon from the signs above, the red from one direction, the blue-white from another, the amber of the street lamps, was reflected in the wet pavement below, and the reflection was fragmented by the irregularities of the wet stone surface, broken into pieces, distributed across the ground in a way that was different from and more interesting than the original source. The sign above, coherent, composed, complete, the intended image. The reflection below, fragmented, dancing slightly as the light rain created moving disturbance on the water surface, the same colors but rearranged, made new by the medium through which they were passing. I stood and looked at the reflection for perhaps 3 minutes. I was looking at a painting that was also a street, and also a mirror, and also a moving image. All of these simultaneously, none of them dominant, each of them available to whatever aspect of attention I turned toward it. I wrote, "The pavement makes better pictures than the signs." I don't know exactly what I meant by this. Something about the way reflection changes and improves its source. Something about the specific quality of things seen indirectly versus directly. Something about how the street, the surface that is walked on without being looked at, that exists as the floor of the city rather than the walls or the ceiling, becomes, in certain conditions, its own kind of art. The rain continued. I kept walking. The theaters. Times Square in March 1948 has more Broadway theaters in operation than any other part of the city, and more than almost any comparable area anywhere in the world. Within a few blocks in every direction, the Ethel Barrymore, where I saw Brando 2 months ago, the St. James, the Imperial, the Majestic, the Music Box, the Lyceum, the Broadhurst, the Schubert, the Booth, the Golden, the Plymouth. At midnight, they are dark. Not entirely dark. The marquees are still lit, some of them, the lights that announce the name of the production and the stars, the specific typography of Broadway marquee design that communicates with its own visual grammar. Mr. Roberts, Anne of the Thousand Days, Me and Molly. Names and names, lit or recently lit, attached to buildings that earlier in the evening contained hundreds of people arranged in the dark to watch something happen on a stage. Now, empty. I walked past the Ethel Barrymore, the marquee, Tennessee Williams, A Streetcar Named Desire. The names of the stars, the box office hours, the specific visual design of a successful Broadway production's advertising that communicates immediately and efficiently. This is what this is who is in it, this is when you can come. At midnight, the theater was dark inside. The performance that had happened at 8 o'clock. The specific, unrepeatable, single occurrence of A Streetcar Named Desire on the evening of whatever Tuesday this was in March 1948, with Brando and Tandy and the specific audience that was there that night and no other. That performance was over. 3 or 4 hours ago, the curtain had come down. The cast had taken their bows. The audience had filed out into the night. The stagehands had reset the set for tomorrow's performance. Gone. The performance was gone. The marquee remained. I stopped in front of the Ethel Barrymore and looked at the marquee at midnight and thought about the performance that had happened and was gone, and about the performances that would happen, tomorrow and the night after, and every night that the play ran, each one slightly different, each one unrepeatable, each one gone as soon as it was over. And the marquee remained. Advertising all of them simultaneously. Advertising the play rather than any specific performance of the play. The thing that persists, the announcement. The thing that is lost, the event. I wrote, "The marquee outlasts the thing it announces." This is either sad or correct, or both. At approximately 1 in the morning, I stopped at a newsstand. The newsstand at 1 in the morning. This is not the newsstand at noon. The noon newsstand is a busy transaction, people buying their paper quickly, on the way somewhere, the exchange brisk and efficient, the newsstand serving as one of the small functional nodes of the city's daily life. At 1 in the morning, the newsstand has different customers. The man running it, heavy-set, wearing a coat that was built for colder weather than March, but which he had been wearing since November and would continue wearing until it was clearly too warm. The coat of someone who has decided on a coat for the winter and is not making further decisions. The man running it was not busy. He was reading his own newspaper, turned to a section I couldn't see, and he looked up when I stopped. He said, "Help you?" I said, "Do you have anything from today?" He had things from today. The late editions, the newspapers that publish their final editions in the evening and that represent the day's news as it had completed itself by 9 or 10 o'clock. I bought one. Not because I needed it, I had read the paper that morning, but because the transaction felt appropriate to the hour and the location and the specific quality of a Tuesday night walk through Times Square that was about paying attention to what was there. The man handed me the paper. I gave him the money. He said, "Cold night." I said, "A little." He said, "March is always cold." I said, "Yes." He went back to his newspaper. I went back to walking. That was the conversation. That was the whole of it. 2 sentences each, a transaction, a brief acknowledgement that the world contained both of us at this hour in this location. And then the separation and the continuation. I thought about Goldstein, who asks about the auditions, who knows I want the rye, who has been building the knowledge of me for 14 months. This newsstand man does not know me. He serves me adequately and efficiently, and without knowledge. He gives me what I asked for. He says it is cold, which I know. It is enough. It is not the same as Goldstein. I have been thinking about this all year, about what the efficient transaction offers and what it cannot offer, about what is gained and lost in the move from the specific to the generic, from Goldstein who knows me to the newsstand man who serves me without knowing me. Both are real. Both are New York. Both are the city at 1 in the morning in March.